Hi, I'm Alex from Wilkinson Cameras. Today we've been at Ironman UK in Bolton testing two different systems, which has been challenging. I've been shooting Nikon and I was using the Z8 and the Z9. These have been absolutely perfect for today and have made it really easy for me to capture great stills and video of the athletes taking part in this, quite frankly, mental race. Right, let's get this out of the way. I've been loaned all of this kit by Nikon, but my opinions today are my own. I'm not being paid by Nikon to tell you how great their cameras are. In fact, there's a few things I don't like about them, but there's a lot that I really love, and I'm going to cover these in the video. Okay then, the Nikon Z9 has been around for around 18 months now, but for most of the time it's been in very short supply. Then this year in May, we saw the Nikon Z8 released. The Nikon Z9 was a massive launch for Nikon with its 45.7 megapixel stacked sensor and DSLR style handling. It's what a lot of users had been waiting for in the Z system. Professional sports and wildlife photographers finally had a mirrorless Nikon camera that they could make the switch to from DSLRs such as the D4, D5 and D6. The Z9 was also the first pro camera, I think of any brand, to completely ditch the mechanical shutter. This is thanks to that stacked sensor and the XSpeed7 processor. I think the Z9 has the fastest sensor readout speed of any camera, or it definitely did at launch anyway. What that means for you is that it doesn't really matter if there's no mechanical shutter because you don't need one. It's also got ridiculously good autofocus and tracking for both stills and video, and very good video features, including up to 8K 60p and 4K 120p. In short, Nikon Z9 is an absolute powerhouse for professionals, particularly sports and wildlife photographers who value either stills, video or both. And it's built like a pro camera too, just look at it. And I think that's why the Z8 has already been so popular and so awaited by photographers. The Z9 is a beast. Yes, this has its advantages, especially when shooting with long lenses, and I really did love the handling of that today. But what we wanted was a baby Z9, and that's exactly what the Z8 delivers. It still retains that DSLR style handling, and Nikon D850 users are definitely going to want to get their hands on this, as well as Z7 II users who want more from their Nikon Z camera. Features wise, well, they're almost identical. Almost. I'll cover some of the similarities and differences throughout the video, but for now, let's put them to the test. I'm going to talk about what these two cameras have in common and where they differ. I'll go through the major features and build and compare them. Then at the end, we'll see which I prefer, and hopefully you can see which one you need for your photography. If you have any questions on anything, put them in the comments and we'll answer as soon as possible. Also, if you enjoy the video, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. So, Nikon Z8 versus Z9, let's go, starting with the sensor. They've both got the same 45.7 megapixel full frame stacked backside illuminated sensor, and they both use the XSpeed7 processor. That means the image quality from both cameras is going to be identical, and they're both going to be super fast with minimum rolling shutter. They can shoot 20 frames per second in RAW up to around 1,000 images. That's shooting onto a CFX Express Type B card in the case of the Z8. Autofocus, they both use the same autofocus system, hybrid AF with 493 phase detection points and advanced subject detection. So the AF on the Nikon Z9 and the Z8, it's the same system, is absolutely brilliant. I'll be honest, I don't use Nikon very often, so I found it a little bit hard work to get it to the settings that I wanted to, but once I'd found everything, it would appear that every single shot that I've got is pin sharp. I did take the Z8 out a little bit back and got some bird in flight, and every single one was just amazing. Like, absolutely brilliant. So yeah, people are excited about the AF in this camera because it's very, very good. Well, as you can see from my outfit today, I came prepared to do some bird photography. I didn't come prepared for that at all, but we did pop out of the office with the Nikon Z8 and I grabbed a variety of lenses, including the 100 to 400, and we found a tree behind us which has loads of herons in it, and we waited for quite a while for one of them to do something, and I put it into high burst shooting. This can do 20 frames per second in RAW and JPEG, which is very fast. Put it in animal AF. The Nikon Z8 doesn't have a dedicated bird mode, but it has an animal mode. So I popped it into that and waited for them to do something. Olivia actually spotted one go. The camera locked on, tracked it, and I was panning at the same time. And from what I've been able to see in the camera, the images are really, really good. We've got a whole series of sharp, in focus pictures of a heron in flight. There's a minor difference in that the Z8 separates out aeroplanes from general vehicles category. I imagine that we'll see this coming to the Z9 through a future firmware update. Low light, they've both got the same ISO sensitivity for stills. That's 64 to 25,600 as standard, but this is expandable down to 32 and up to 102,400. Base ISO for NLog when shooting a video is different between the two. A nice improvement for video with the latest firmware update for the Z9 is that NLog's base ISO has been reduced down from 800 to 200. This is brilliant news for videographers, as it means you can ensure that there is less noise in your footage, but also it can eliminate the need for an ND filter in some situations as well. That's not good for me because I want to sell you an ND filter, but it is good for videographers who don't want an additional step, or still shooters who are switching between the two quite rapidly. The Z8 sticks, for now anyway, with a base ISO for video of 800. I'd like to hope that we'll see this come down with a firmware update like on the Z9. Speaking of video, let's see how those video specs compare. The Z8 and Z9 have dedicated video modes and video menus which allow you to properly customise the camera and access the most needed settings depending on what you're shooting. The Z9 was the first Nikon camera offering up to 8K video 60p with no crop. Impressive stuff. The Z8 inherits these same specifications, and in fact, apart from the ISO, almost all the video specs are identical. The main difference is that the Z9 will support unlimited recording in any mode, or at least within the constraints of your storage and power options. The Z8, while supporting all the same codecs and frame rates, does have limits on how long it can record. For example, I think the Z8 tops out around 90 minutes of 8K footage before it will start overheating. But that is a lot of 8K footage, especially when you consider the file sizes that we're talking about for this kind of resolution. One thing that you're going to need to know about shooting in NRoll is that it's not widely supported, despite the Z9 being capable of internal NRoll since May 2022, over a year ago. In particular, it's not supported in Adobe Premiere Pro, or at least at the time that I'm making this video. We found this out the hard way because when I was setting up the cameras, I naturally wanted to test NRoll, so that's the option that I chose. That meant that Olivia had to install and learn how to use DaVinci Resolve in order to do anything with the video shot that day. Some might argue that Resolve is better for colour grading, but when your whole workflow is Adobe, it's not ideal. That being said, NRoll is pretty incredible. Just look how much of this massively overexposed scene she was able to save. If you do decide to shoot in NRoll, then you'll be glad to know that proxy files are also saved alongside the absolutely massive 8K or 4K files by default as well. Both cameras shoot 12-bit RAW and ProRes HQ 10-bit internally and have NLog and HLG modes. They both have 4K or 120p frame rate options for gorgeous, detailed slow motion footage. Stills capabilities and qualities are, as you'd expect, almost identical. The Nikon Z8 has the edge here thanks to the addition of HEIF file formats. HEIF, is that how we're going to say that? Or is it HEIF? HEIF? I don't know. What's the plan? We don't call JPEGs JPEG files. Anyway, HEIF files, or whatever we're going to call them, are 10-bit files that capture a broader dynamic range than a JPEG. And they're not overly well supported at the moment, but along with the sister file format, HIEC, we are seeing them more and more. Will this be added to the Z9 in a firmware update? I highly suspect that this will be the case. Let's compare the build quality and handling features of the Z8 and Z9. It's quite obvious that there is a massive difference in the size, weight and general design of the two cameras. The Z9 is a traditional flagship DSLR design with a double grip for enhanced ergonomics, especially when shooting portrait, and this also leaves space for a much bigger battery. It does weigh in at over 1.3 kilos, which is actually only 100 grams lighter than the Nikon D6. The Z8, on the other hand, is much smaller, but don't worry DSLR fans, it's not super small. I actually think it's rather large for a mirrorless camera, at 910 grams for the body. But for the lenses I've been using it with and the technology it's housing, I'm not complaining. You do have the option to add a battery grip to the Z8, should you want that added flexibility of the double grip. Speaking of batteries, the Z8 and the Z9 take different batteries. The Z9's overall larger build means it can take the EN-EL18D battery, and this means that you're going to get roughly double the battery life versus the Z8. I used a full battery on the Z8 today and had to switch it probably about 5 hours into shooting. The Z9, I did have a spare with me, but I didn't need to use it. I still had loads of battery life at the end of the day. The Z8, despite being much smaller and lighter, still feels very well made. It feels like a professional camera. It is a professional camera. The grip is really big, and even with big telephoto lenses, it's well balanced and feels easy to use. I certainly wouldn't be worrying about either of these cameras standing up to pro use wear and tear. Both cameras feature a top display showing battery life, basic camera settings, what mode you're in, etc. On the top of the camera, you don't have a traditional mode dial. You have this button arrangement, and you can change modes by holding a button and then using your other hand to move the rear control wheel on the top of the right hand side of the camera. I absolutely hate this. These aren't the first Nikon cameras to introduce this, so Nikon users will be familiar with the setup, but why take a one-handed operation and turn it into two? The Z9 takes this annoyance a step further by making the sub-wheel under it require two hands. Both Olivia and I have, I'd say, probably mid-length nails. We can't push the button down and move the dial with one hand as our nails get in the way. And I totally get that people aren't designing the Z9 with this in mind, but just put a lock button on the top like other brands instead of this little tiny button to the side. I know that these are minor in the grand scheme of things, and with the overall capabilities of this camera, I would learn to overlook it, but I just hate this whole setup. I really don't get on with it. But let's get back to the positive. Both cameras feature the same massive 3.69mm OLED viewfinder. I found this very pleasant to use. The image is bright and large. It's exactly what you want to see on cameras of this level. It retains the round styling that a lot of Nikon DSLRs featured. Both feature the same screen on the back. The rear monitor is a four-way tilting touchscreen. It's easy to use and the touchscreen is very responsive, and I found this very, very useful. Interestingly, there are some differences when it comes to the inputs on the two cameras. The Z8 actually has an additional USB-C port supporting power delivery. This means that you could use this to connect it to an Ethernet connector, as the Z8 doesn't have an Ethernet port like the Z9 does. That's a pretty cool feature for press photographers who want a mini Z9 and need that level of connectivity. Both cameras take CF Express Type B cards. The Z9 has two Type B slots, so you are going to need to invest in new memory cards. If you're planning on shooting a lot of 8K, then you're going to want to factor in large capacity cards and budget for the additional costs here. Realistically, you are going to be setting aside a few £100 or dollars extra for the cards for this camera. The Nikon Z8 does have a UHS 2 SD card slot, as well as a CF Express Type B slot, but you're going to need to be using the Type B to get the very most out of the camera. I've set it up to record video to the CF Express card and store my stills to the SD. This is better for our workflow, and as well it means I can simply hand over the video content to Olivia so she can edit all of the video for me. One key difference between the two, and it's not one that I've seen mentioned very often, is that the Z9 has built-in GPS. On the Z8 to geotag, you need to connect this to a smartphone. Now, GPS isn't a crucial factor to a lot of photographers, But I know that for some it's extremely important, and it often goes hand in hand with needing a robust camera like the Z9. So this is a really great feature to see here. I think it would have been nice to actually see this in the Z8 as well, but I guess you can't have everything in such a small body. Earlier, I briefly mentioned auto capture. The Z9 has had a few major firmware upgrades since launch, and it's worth pointing out that these firmware upgrades are free, and they're also very easy to install yourself at home. As well as significant additions to the camera, there's also been lots of minor improvements or minor bug fixes, and it's great to see that Nikon are dedicated to ensuring this professional camera is being continually evolved and improved. Previous firmware updates, for example, added improved AF accuracy and improved low light performance, and introduced ProRes RAW 12-bit video recording options. Firmware 4, the latest release, has added quite a major new feature called auto capture. Auto capture is pretty cool. It allows you to remotely capture a subject without a trigger or wireless connections. There's some situations where you couldn't physically be present to get the best shot, whether that's capturing wildlife or getting a unique angle on a sport, let's say underneath a hurdle, for example. You can set up the direction of movement, speed of movement, along with other key factors. When these are met, the camera will fire automatically. And this works for both stills and video modes, and there's no limitations on other settings. All your existing settings will still work, and it even works with pre-release as well. I've had a look at the menu for this, and it definitely wasn't something that we wanted to try out at Iron Man. You're probably going to need a little bit of trial and error, and it wasn't something I wanted to be trialling by the roadside with lots of people around, and I definitely didn't want to leave a Z9 unattended. But we have tried this here today at my house with my cats. It's actually quite easy to set up, and it works really, really well. I would say, yeah, you do need to try it and find out which settings work best for you. But if you need to be away from a subject to capture it, or if you know that a movement's coming that you want to capture, you can preset everything to fire the camera. And it did work really well on my cat, but unfortunately he was being incredibly lazy and he wasn't really performing today. So we've got some samples, but they're not the most exciting uses for auto capture. So the final comparison, and this is a big one, the price. In the UK right now, the Nikon Z9 is $5,299. The Z8 is $3,999. Neither of these cameras are cheap. £4,000 is no small chunk of change, and especially if you're switching systems and you want to use the latest Z lenses. But that's a £1,300 difference between the two models. The difference is huge, and really, for the majority of users, the difference between these two cameras is minimal. If you need a bigger battery, more rugged build, Ethernet built in, double grip ergonomics, advanced handling, potential for unlimited video recording, auto capture and built-in GPS, you're going to have to get the Z9. For most photographers, videographers or hybrid shooters, including most professionals, you'll probably be just fine with the Z8. And I say just fine, but you are going to love this camera. It is remarkably good. I have got so many shots to go through from today's shoot, and at first glance, they are all in focus and all full of detail. It's going to be a nightmare narrowing them down, but it just shows how capable this camera is. If you're switching from another system, and you might be tempted, you'll just need to get used to the Nikon menu system and some of the button setups. I wouldn't be surprised if some Z9 owners actually downsize to the Z8. So now you know how the Z8 and Z9 compare. Which are you going to buy? I think I might just forget to send back the Z8 to Nikon. I really loved using this camera. If you liked this video, then please give it a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel. If you've got any questions, then let us know in the comments. If you want to see some more in-depth testing of the Z8 or the Z9, then let us know which features you want to see, and we'll try to do a separate video. Right, shall we talk about the elephant in the room? And that's Z8 and Z9 product recalls. Lenses not attaching to Z8s, lenses getting stuck on Z9s. You've probably heard that both cameras have had product recalls. It's as though they fixed the Z9 problem a little bit too well. It's far from ideal. In fact, it's pretty embarrassing for Nikon, but I would rather see a minor mechanical issue sorted out in the earliest production models that gets fixed and is an easy fix for future batches than discovering a more major issue come out of the woodwork much later down the line. Am I worrying about the build quality of the Z8 or Z9? No, not at all. These cameras are fantastic. I am worried about the effects it's going to have on availability of the Z8. I think it's going to add to production delays in an already highly in-demand camera, but I'm not worrying about the build quality, so I don't think you should either.